Well, it's been a while. Thank you very much to Anthony for inviting me, and for Jonathan and Dawn and John for helping me put this together. It's really a pleasure to be back with you. And I just wanted to acknowledge that my colleague, Rhett Baird, is here, and I'm very honored that he's here. And also to recognize that my husband and son, Ben, are here. And I know exactly when Ben went to bed last night, so. Dragon Con. So thank you. Oh, no, I've embarrassed him. Okay. But it's been a while since I've been able to do that. Right, yay. A few years back, on one of my many trips to Boston for meetings at what was then our association headquarters at the foot of Beacon Hill, I had actually arrived about a half day early, which gave me enough time to board a train for Concord, Massachusetts, a kind of pilgrimage mecca for Unitarians. After the short train ride, we disembarked in the midst of a sudden late spring New England squall, unprepared, umbrella-less, sloshing through muddy streets. We arrived at our sacred destination, Louisa May Alcott's family home, just down the street from Ralph Waldo Emerson's, a very modest cottage immortalized for generations of girls as the setting for Little Women. Drenched and shivering, but still eager for our visit, to our dismay, we were informed that the house, oh my gosh, it's even hard to share it today, was temporarily closed to the public. A large group of Japanese teenagers had arranged for a private tour and were due to arrive any moment. That would not do. We told the woman selling admissions tickets that we were, after all, Unitarian religious leaders who had come all the way from Seattle and from Atlanta just to see this holy place, where one of the most exalted Unitary saints, one of our very own, had once lived. Which was just not so true at all. This visit to Orchard House was not, truth be told, the reason for our travels to Boston, but I fortunately timed a side trip. And like so many of our famous Unitarians, Louisa May Alcott actually never joined one of our churches. Nonetheless, we got the ticket seller's attention and curt New England sympathy, if you know what I'm talking about. She would see what she could do. While she disappeared into an office, we browsed the well-stocked gift shop filled with lots of different copies of Alcott's books, dolls, and the likenesses of the four little women. I think there were actually magnets, too, soaps, and spoons, and other souvenirs. I settled on a small framed quote by the author: "Work is my salvation." Even as I purchased it, I wondered why I did not recognize the quote as being from any of the 8 volumes of the Little Women series that I'd either devoured or dutifully finished when I was a child, because it was actually not from any of her many novels or collections of serially published short stories. It was actually extracted from a journal entry from one of the few pages that, at her request, survived her death. She actually blacked out most of her journal, and then she asked it to be burned, and she hardly wrote any letters. So this was like one of the only things, and this is where the quote was from. It is not, then, the words of dialogue spoken by a made-up character, but the heartfelt declaration of the author herself. I did not know then the extent to which the divine purpose of work peppered Louisa May Alcott's personal writings, or that one of the most popular novels she wrote, popular in her lifetime, once considered lost and recently found, was Work, A Story of Experience. How many of you Louisa May Alcott fans have read this book? Thank you, John. Not very well written, actually. Which she had originally titled Success, the tale of a working girl who both earned her living and intimate standing with God, who she called her almighty friend, through noble labor and humble, wholesome duties. which more than any of other books that Louisa wrote was modeled after her own life as a 19th century young woman whose sphere of possible work for money was really very narrowly constricted by gender and class, mostly limited to being a servant, or a seamstress, or a governess, or a practical nurse, or a companion. That was just about what was available. Unpredictable and exhausting labor, which she was fortunate enough to occasionally escape when her books were selling well. But even up to the last years of her life, when she could hardly see, she was stitching. She was stitching things. My colleague and I finally did get a chance for a quick walk through the house. We got to see, where she had written in the garret. We got to see the drawings on the wall that Amy did in the novel. It was really super cool. Before the large tourist book arrived, and I transported that seemingly odd moral message memento in my carry-on bag back home, where it has stood prominently on one office bookshelf or another. So then why this particular keepsake and its very crisp message, work is my salvation? Well, of course, Mom, one of my sons, tells me, you've always been all about work, and you still are. It must be something more than just collecting a paycheck. And it is true that in a couple of years, I would have been employed for pay for 50 years. Not even counting the babysitting and the ice cream scooping and the camp counseling jobs of my youth and college years. I hashed for the UCLA basketball team and met Lou Alcindor. That's what he was. You can touch me. It was really cool. It is also true, which was made evident to me just a few weeks ago when I attended my 50th high school reunion and through dinner conversation learned that the overwhelming majority of my classmates had already retired, had willingly put their work lives aside, their paid work lives. In fact, they were really more interested in talking about the time that Janet Lampy's mother taught us how to make hospital corners and Girl Scouts. That I am among the very, very small percentage of boomers my age that is still working at all, under a third of us, and around 18% of women. Yes, I have worked and I am still working under the presumption that it has significant meaning and purpose. But salvation through work, beyond the money earned literally saving us from hunger and homelessness, what did it mean to our religious forebears, and how does it continue to inform and shape us now? Several UU ministers, including me, sit on a religious coalition board in which our Unitarian Universalist faith tradition has been described as Protestant, to which, as a second-generation Jewish humanist whose parents joined a Unitarian congregation in the mid-20th century, I have been known to express strong objections. No, we are not that. We are different. We are so much more. One of my colleagues in that ecumenical group, on the other hand, has no such objections, maintaining that we quite simply cannot deny the historical fact of the larger Christian Reformation, either small r or large r, we were part of in our founding, and the overwhelmingly Protestant environment of the society that surrounded us then and continues to surround us now, including the Protestant work ethic, its path to salvation, and the notion of work as calling that flows from it. So I'm going to do a little wonky religious history refresher. Is that okay? And if I'm wrong, let me know. So we got the Catholics before, the one Catholic church, and your way to salvation was not direct. It was through the what? The priest, to whom you confessed your sins, and then you got a buy, right? Or you could actually buy indulgences and say, I'll pay you, and then the sin gets erased. Well, that went away during the Reformation because the really key part of Reformation Christianity was you had a more direct relationship with God. No more praise, no more buy-in indulgences. It's all about you and trying to figure out if you're good with Jesus and good with God, which was what? Highly anxiety-producing. okay? So Luther just couldn't stand it. I mean, he said, like, my God, I just can't stand this anymore. But okay, I'll try to accept that all I have to do is accept Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. But he really never got over the anxiety. John Calvin and the Calvinists decided the way they could deal with their anxiety was just to give up, say that actually God was in charge from before we were born and we were predestined, so God knew who was going to be saved and who was going to be damned. God had already chosen our worldly position, our life's labor, which we would do to God's glory, and what our labor was kind of an indication of whether we were good to go or not. So God already knew. Anyway, so you following me? Okay. Our status, our success was the highest form of moral activity and proof of our righteousness in the eyes of God and our inevitable salvation. Some would prosper. That was really important. It was about money, prosperity, which was an obvious sign of divine favor. So if you were successful and you made money, clearly you were good to go. And others would be poor, a sign from God of ill favor and moral failing. So that was the Protestant Revolution and what it meant in terms of trying to second-guess God. This theology of either predestined salvation or damnation and the calling, the work callings that revealed in life who was already saved or doomed for eternity was rejected by our early American Unitarian ministers and theologians. They weren't good with this. It wasn't all done when we were born. I mean, there had got to be a sort of a negotiation with God. We had to talk to God and figure out what God wanted, and often it was through the work that we did. Louisa May Alcott's mother, whose family belonged to King's Chapel and whose brother was the minister of the Unitarian Society in Brooklyn, would have heard messages from the pulpit emphatically denouncing the dogma of original sin, and that was another catch. You're already originally sinful, you couldn't get out of that, and preordained judgment, which had separated us from the Congregational and other Protestant denominations of the time. She would have, however, listened to sermons from these pulpits reminding and admonishing her that we still have to work out our own salvation. Work being the operative word. That on this earthly plane we bear the total responsibility ourselves for discerning God's ongoing desires for us and responding to our individual callings from this God, preferably with good faith, good patience, and good cheer. That was Unitarian Universalism and its notion of callings and work. It didn't just happen before we were born, but we had to work at it through our work. Ralph Waldo Emerson's views on salvation provided by work had a great impact on Louisa May Alcott personally because she adored him. In fact, she had a childhood crush on him. And others of the early Unitarian circle were also infatuated by his idea. With his belief in limitless human potential, he wrote, "Work in every hour, see only through work, and thou canst not escape the reward." Again, work. Work through your human potential, but work. For him, the achievement of both worldly and spiritual success was placed solidly on each person, to know him or herself, to be self-reliant, and to be dedicated to what he called self-culture. For others in that small New England circle, some of whom who were beginning to refer to themselves as transcendentalists, they believed that God was less of a personal deity that you negotiated with, who was either stern or kindly, than a mystic aspiration, that we are each one of us born with a spark of the divine, of a spark of the divine whole, but that creating the conditions within which to find and freely and fully use that spark was the responsibility not just of the individual, but a collective calling. Within our liberal religious movement of the time, unified as it was against the Calvinist dogmas of divine predestination, of inescapable sinfulness, there were then big schisms around the meaning of work. Were we still to trust completely in a relationship with a more benevolent, providential God and in our faithful and persevering work to navigate our time on earth and whatever lay ahead, no matter what the hardships and indignities were? Or did we selectively second-guess God's timeline and offer direct charity to those for whom worldly success had not yet or might never come? Or were there conditions and practices and powers and principalities that no one person could overcome alone in order to truly live out our gifts that needed changing in the here and now, whether by experiments in utopian living through shared labor and income equality, or by abolishing slavery, by gaining voting and other rights for women, and workers' rights in general? Louisa May Alcott's own family mirrored these divisions. Her father, Bronson, moved his family to a place called Brook Farm for a time, where they toiled until hunger and other deprivations and quarreling closed this experiment down. This and other failed transcendentalist enterprises, including a controversial progressive school, forced Louisa to be the bread earner, partly through her own writing. Her mother, on the other hand, worked with shunned and impoverished Irish women in Boston to find them employment and improved living conditions. While Louisa pieced her own working life together, this work that was her salvation right up to her untimely and painful death, despite the barriers thrown up against her gender's welfare and progress, and the unremitting personal tragedies and illnesses that plagued her. But while she supported the causes of abolition and women's suffrage, she would not have been in Red and Roses parades. She did not believe in the cause of workers' rights. How shocking for me. But she didn't, because she believed it was God's hands still. She was in that school that said, God's got the answer for you. You have to be patient, and it will work out sometime or another. In fact, through her surrogate character, Christy, in her work novel, Louisa May Alcott disavowed the well-to-do activist women who she felt had little or no actual experience of what it was actually like to be a low-income working woman, whose fiery rhetoric, she believed, offered no practical relief and caused only despair. So instead, she described labor as her own best teacher, her comforter and friend, leaving it to God to lead all workers to the larger liberty that they were meant to enjoy. These differing worldviews within the Alcott family mirrored what was going on in our rancorous Unitarian pews, especially in those congregations where the well-to-do parishioners might have been more than willing to charitably comfort the afflicted, but not pleased at all to have any preacher afflict the comfortable, with thoughts of changing the basic economic and social order, whether it was by ending racial enslavement or building opportunities for the poor simply to do better, to get the basic of their lives, let alone self-actualizing, and let alone thriving. So that's the background of Unitarianism and work. That's where I came into as a child of the mid-20th centuries in this association. And as an inheritor of the somewhat jumbled, you think, American Unitarian theology of work, I came into a faith tradition and a larger society, particularly the vocational pressure cooker that would have become later the Silicon Valley, where I grew up, where work for me unquestionably would be my salvation. Not just being trained and educated for work, but finding my unique inner spark. Not just seeking and getting work, but imbuing this work with transcendent meaning and purpose. In my economically privileged community in schools, all the aptitude and achievement and personality trait tests that could be created and marketed were and tried out on me and my classmates. As I entered adulthood, all the books on finding the perfect match between gifts and calling, including the very first and subsequent 44 editions of What Color Is Your Parachute?, which has promised millions of readers a fulfilling and prosperous life's work. And now there are books on working with passion, books on best jobs for your skills, works on best jobs for your personality, books on best jobs for low stress, and my personal favorite, best jobs for introverts. All of the books, all of the tests available to me in order not just to work, but to work with very great meaning and purpose. Surrounded by the publication of inspiring individual stories of people who have found purpose and passion in their work, no matter how unexpected or untraditional, a bridge watcher, a tool and die worker, and all these other amazing people who have made meaning and purpose out of their lives and their careers, which was praised as path-breaking exploration of the extraordinary dreams of ordinary people, from hookers to grave diggers. The spark, the literature, the models, the pressure, the moral imperative were all there, and it's not surprising to me that 50 years later, Palo Alto High School and the schools in Palo Alto have incredibly high suicide rates among the kids who are tested and asked to have great plans when they're 14 and 15 years and work with great meaning and purpose. As a minister in this liberal religious tradition and inheritor of our theology of calling and work, I spent a great deal of my formation time, which began 20 years ago this week, listing out my previous vocation, and there have been several, explaining how they had led or not led me to what should have been considered my ultimate calling, and crafting a perfect personal mission statement, my saving message. And this was my mission statement: to bear courageous and authentic witness. To bear courageous and authentic witness, which I had done or tried to do as a journalist, which I had done or tried to do as a secular advocate for women and children, especially around what we call now reproductive justice. But all of the reporting I did and all of the speechifying I did had led to little. While I was not naive and knew that progress in any social justice arena would be slow, it was an economic justice issue around women in work, or more accurately, not working, that turned me towards ministry in this faith tradition with a hope and faith in our theology as I had come to understand it. So I want to tell you what that was. In 1995, what was described as a landmark welfare reform bill was introduced in Congress. And how many people even know what that one was? Yeah, okay. Under this legislation, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, which had been created originally to give cash assistance to widowed mothers, was replaced by what has now become the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. In exchange for a few $100s a month, this so-called reform bill introduced strict, nearly impossible work requirements for the children of all but the very youngest children, and a maximum of 60 months of assistance over a lifetime for a mother. It severely limited access to benefits for non-citizens and the formerly incarcerated. The national child advocates I knew despaired of its possible passage and enactment, yet the racially charged visuals of cigarette-smoking welfare queens, the dog whistle message in them, overwhelmed what we thought was our compelling data and our warnings of the consequences, most especially to the children whose health and welfare would be most damaged, which is exactly what came to pass. Our warnings were for naught, and more than the cynical stances of the lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who voted for it, and the president, who will not be named, who signed this measure, because it's an election year, my despair arose from the apparent willingness of my local secular colleagues to just go along, to blithely count on a reversal of this legislation in some future date, no matter how unlikely, and it never happened. Work as my salvation, to bear courageous and authentic witness. I needed quite desperately to match my calling to right livelihood. By the time TANF became the law of the land 20 years ago last month, I'd applied to and been accepted at theology school on my way to becoming a professional minister. It was, you see, my deep hope and expectation that our rejection as a faith movement those many years ago of the doctrine of predestination, which religious sociologists have found still serves as an inspiration and rationalization for condemning the poor, would provide the solid underpinnings I needed to continue my social justice work. that we believe that affluence and success are not divinely decreed. We believe that poverty is not an indication of inescapable failure, ripe for punishment, that our belief in individual giftedness and grit does not preclude our commitment to collective action and recognition and remedying of the structures and systems that block the way forward for so many people. That our religion, that our tradition does not exist to support the status quo, but to be prophetic as well, to affirm and promote justice and compassion. My spark, my calling, your spark, your calling. On this Labor Day 2016, I share the words of Reverend Kendall Gibbons. In the memory of sacrifice and enduring hope, liberation. In the dignity and worth of every soul, our salvation. In the power of love and human spirit, transformation. May this be our work today and every day, and may it be so.